Okay, welcome again to Science and Democracy, Wetenskap og Demokrati. And this week we'll talk about the question or the issues of relying on experts when we form opinions about various matters on which there are experts. In the first part of the lecture, we'll take up the issue of epistemic dependence. And that's the question of how we, for our knowledge about the world or for forming good or reasoned beliefs about the world, need to depend on others. And I have chosen as the reading for that an article by Hardwick on this with this very title that I think nicely illustrates how we really do depend on others in order to have knowledge about the world. Even though the article, as I will also mention, has several problems. Okay. Now, there's a background for this discussion. And the background is this idea from the Enlightenment period, arguably it's older than that, that just taking up what others believe about various things is a bad thing. So I'll use this illustrate this with three thinkers of this important Enlightenment period. So the Enlightenment period was roughly from the 16th century, 15th, 16th century to the 19th century. And it's associated very much with this idea that you should think for yourself and that you should use reason rather than the opinion of others to counter view about it. So this Enlightenment ideal, for example, is expressed in Francis Bacon's writings against various what he calls idols of the mind. So these are sort of bad habits that we tend to have when we form beliefs, and we should get rid of them when we in order to get knowledge about the world. And there are two that are relevant in particular here, and those he calls, one of them he calls idols of the marketplace. So we have all this tendency, he thinks, and I think he's right to observe that we just say what's common sense about something, what everyone says about something. So what you hear in the marketplace, where everyone talks about what's happening in town, there's certain things that everyone just says. We have a tendency to just go with those beliefs. It's a bad thing. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't just believe what everyone says, thinks Bacon. Another one he calls the idols of the theater. And that's not so much the marketplace, but what the authorities say about that. So this quotation, these are dogmas of philosophy, but also many of the principles and axioms in science, which by tradition, credulity, and negligence have come to be received. So various things, the philosophers, the scientists about the various aspects of the world that they think, we just have a tendency to simply believe them because they're tradition, because we're just like negligent and don't want to think for ourselves. That's Bacon. Another thinker that expresses that you think for yourselves very well is Immanuel Kant in a famous essay answering the question, what is enlightenment? And he says, enlightenment is a man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use your own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding. It's not because you can't think for yourself, but a lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of the Enlightenment is therefore sapere aude. That means have the courage to use your own understanding. Again, very much this idea, use your own understanding, don't blindly trust others or follow others. Descartes also famously is an Enlightenment thinker. He has this idea that also one should not just try to get rid of all one's opinions, all the beliefs that happen to be that one happens to have and try to rebuild one's system of beliefs by only relying on one can know for certain, and that is something what each of us needs to do for ourselves. So again, this is this big philosophical project, the Enlightenment, that it's really good and important to think for yourself and don't trust blindly others. This idea that thinking for yourself is important is also a natural way, anyway, of understanding Clifford's evidentialism that we saw in our first module. Remember, Clifford thinks that it's wrong always and everywhere for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And some of you have now written your critical responses about that. It certainly seems that he thought that we shouldn't be gullible and believe everything you were told, and instead we should aim to assemble evidence or reasons for our beliefs. So it's bad for this ship owner to simply believe that the ship is fine upon insufficient evidence. Natural understanding is that what he should have done is not just believe what someone tells him, but he should have really looked at the evidence regarding the ship. So from observations, done statistics, use his own understanding. Finally, one might think that it indeed, this idea that in a certain sense we need to think for ourselves follows from the basic requirements for knowledge. Knowledge requires that we have good reasons for our beliefs, that we believe what we believe with a justification. So knowledge is justified true belief. Those who of you have had some philosophy before, they have probably heard this. And a natural understanding is then again that just hearing someone say something is not itself a good reason to believe it. Okay? Justification requires using some good method. That can be observation, that can be using rationality, and the empiricists and the rationalists were in disagreement about which one's more important, but you need to use some good method, and just hearing someone talk about it is not itself good enough. So this then forms the ideal of epistemic independence that says that relying epistemically on others is a sign of epistemic immaturity. It is a sign that your views are mere opinion and not a sign of knowledge, and it's a sign that you're gullible. You just take it. You just believe what others say. Okay. So Hardwick thinks that's all wrong. So his first observation, which I think is the one that is very important, even if trivial, is that the epistemic authority of others is the basis for almost everything I believe. So he has these things there, and these are things that I could say too. Smoking cigarettes causes lung cancer. How do I know that? I know it because I read it in a book. My car keeps stalling because the carburetor needs to be rebuilt. I mean, that's something the car mechanic told me. I don't even really know what a carburetor is, but I did know that my car is stalling, and I believe that's true on the authority of the car mechanic. I believe that mass media threaten democracy because I'm doing a research project on it and I've read about that. Believe that slums cause emotional disorders. Again, I'm an educated reader reading about this in some newspapers. Or I believe that my irregular heartbeat is a premature ventricular contraction. I believe that because it's something my doctor tells me. I believe all these things on the basis of the authority of others. And we can add many, many, many more things. And most of the things we really believe because someone's told us or we've read about it. And in many cases, we don't really even understand what the things that we believe really mean. Okay. So it's happening. Is it a bad thing? According to the ideal of epistemic independence, it would seem to be a bad thing. Hardwick's goal then in this article showed that epistemic independence is both not realistic, it's not a realistic goal, and it's also not an ideal. And he argues for this in sort of 3 parts. On the first part, he argues that we can have what he thinks are good reasons to believe something, even though we don't have evidence for its truth. So we can have good reasons to believe something, even though we don't have any evidence that it's true. That's interesting. And he thinks that a case for that is a case like that, a case where we have good reasons that others have good reasons to believe that thing. That is not a case of having evidence that the thing is true, but he thinks that's a good reason to believe it. So exactly in the case where we rely on the authority of others. And he thinks further that it's rational to do that. It's rational to not think for yourself often, but to trust an expert. Indeed, it's often more rational to do that than to try to think for yourself. Finally, both of these aspects of rationality, both of these, this relying on others and relying on them more than trusting yourself, are aspects of rationality that are essential to scientific knowledge, I think. So it's not, it's built into a lot of scientific knowledge, its reliance on others. So it's not even an ideal for sort of knowledge, this idea for science, that scientists should kind of try to think for themselves. Okay, brief definition. This sort of is going to be important. Hardwick defines evidence for some proposition, like, for example, evidence that smoking causes lung cancer, as anything that counts toward establishing the truth of P. So evidence on this understanding is something objective. So something that would establish the truth of, for example, this proposition that smoking causes lung cancer. So, for example, a medical finding that people who have smoked, many more of those people have had lung cancer. That seems to be something that counts toward establishing the truth of that proposition that smoking causes it, that there's a strong correlation. It's not sufficient to establish it, but it is some evidence. Okay, this is the understanding of evidence. And having a good reason to believe P, since he wants to show that sometimes we have good reason to believe P without evidence, in his understanding of having good reason to believe something, that doesn't itself entail that's evidence. So let's say that we have good reason to believe something. It means, I think, on his understanding, 2 things: that it's at least okay to believe it. You wouldn't be, it wouldn't be, you couldn't be criticized for believing it. So it's fine. You're permitted to believe it. There's nothing criticizable about it. And second, I think he doesn't say that really, but it probably also means that it's not equally okay not to believe it. So having good reason to believe something it means, I think, that it's not equally okay not to believe it. Okay. I'm not entirely sure whether he thinks that, but I think that Hardwick is not just talking about cases like we saw in William James, where it's okay to go either way, where it's okay to choose to believe one way or another. I think he thinks about cases where we have a reason to believe something, and not, which means we have not equally reason to not believe it. Okay, then we come to reasons without evidence. How can we have reasons to believe something without having evidence for it? Right, the cases that he thinks about, Hardwick, the cases where there's one person, A, some expert, who has evidence for the relevant proposition. So let's say there's evidence for the proposition that the R0 value of the SARS-CoV-2 virus is greater than 3. Okay. Why does it have evidence? Because he's an expert in virology. So there's a German virologist that, for example, did research on this, Drosten. So he sort of has evidence for this, yeah, because that's what he's studying this virus. Now, me, on the other hand, I don't have any evidence for this. I don't even really understand what an R0 value is. And I could not conduct this research at all. Try to think for myself about this proposition. Is it true or not? I wouldn't even know how to start. Okay. Let's suppose. I mean, maybe I actually know now a little more, but that's where I was certainly about 1 year ago. I didn't understand any of these terms even. Okay, but I believe this still because I read in the tweet that A has put out. Okay. Now, I do have reasons to believe that that person A, has in fact evidence for this proposition. I mean, after all, this person A is a world experts in virology. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that this person knows. So I think that he has the evidence. Okay. So I have reason to believe that he has the evidence, because I do know that he is a first-class virologist. Now, question: is this a case where I have good reason to believe the proposition? We have good reason to believe that the R0 value of the SARS-CoV-2 virus is greater than 3. Now, if that's so, then, according to Hardwick, that would be a good reason to believe something that's not evidence for the proposition. So, why does he think that? Why does he think that the fact that the expert believes this is not evidence for the proposition? Now, he gives two related reasons. So one is that having a reason to believe something, that someone else has reason to believe something, is not something that makes it more likely that P is true. So the fact that I discovered that A is in fact an eminent virologist does not at all make it more likely that the R0 value of the SARS-CoV-2 virus is greater than 3. I mean, this is not something that makes it more likely that the proposition in question is true. I mean, the one is about this virus and how it spreads around. Whether some particular person is an eminent virologist doesn't really bear on whether that's true. So I think that can't be evidence for it because it's not something that counts that counts in favor of the truth of that. Okay. And he also thinks that because without A's evidence, so he seems to think that evidence, if it would be evidence, then I mean it should count itself for something. So the fact that this person A is an eminent virologist itself doesn't count for anything with regard to P. It only counts for something given that A does in fact have evidence for the proposition. So he thinks that means that it isn't really any evidence. Okay, so he thinks that if we could establish that this is a case where I have good reason to believe P, then it would be a case where I have good reasons to believe it, but I don't have any evidence for it. Now, okay, so why then is it rational to believe, for example, this thing about the coronavirus, because I believe that someone else has good reason to think it. And the natural idea that Hardwick defends is that it's because I have evidence that the virologist knows what she's talking about. And so when they say something, they say it especially in public, in their official on the official Twitter account, then that's likely true. So he gives another reason also, which is to think that I think, look, it seems this division of labor between the various people is a good thing. It's a quote from Hardwick. It would be paradoxical for epistemologists to maintain that the more is known in the culture, the less rational the beliefs individuals in that culture become. Why is that? I mean, but why would they become less rational? Because, as there's more and more knowledge, and people know it and they talk to others about it, then the more we rely on others to form beliefs about various things, and then all the beliefs become irrational. So go back into like the world of my great-great-grandparents, farmers in rural Germany. Most of the things they believed about, they didn't read in a book. They learned about it firsthand. They were more like Descartes. But they knew a lot less than I do because I've read so many books. And it seems like, well, if that would be all irrational, then it seems absurd that adding more knowledge into the world, adding books and reading books would just make it less, my belief, rational, because I don't have the time and energy to now follow through and check everything myself. Okay. So we're going to return to this issue of how we could find out whether some particular person is the kind of person that knows what they're talking about. So how could I, in fact, get reason to believe that A has reason to believe it? How to do that for a particular person? I'll get to that when we talk about Goldman. And also, well, with regard to the second thing, I already mentioned that it seems that the epistemic division of labor is a good thing. So that's a reason that Hardwick gives. Now, but let's return to this question: is it an ideal to rely on others? Maybe I should have courage to use my own understanding. I should start my philosophical meditations, like Descartes, like the Enlightenment thinkers thought. I shouldn't just rely on others and believe what experts say on the basis of their Twitter feeds and so on. So might it still be an ideal that we should think of ourselves and base our beliefs on the evidence rather than on the authority of others? Harder things not. The problem is if we try to do that, if we try to do what Descartes did, to go into a room, shut down all the computers, don't take any books with us, and really now investigate whether all the things we used to believe are really true, and then find a firm foundation from which to build everything up again. The problem is, with doing that, we would cut ourselves off all the experts who know about things. And that would make us, epistemically speaking, Hardwick thinks, a lot worse off than we were before. So here's a quote. If we were to pursue epistemic autonomy, so independence of the opinions of others across the board, I would succeed only in holding a relatively uninformed, unreliable, crude, untested, and therefore irrational beliefs. So that's, maybe my great-great-grandparents, they had various beliefs about the crops, and they had various beliefs about a lot of things that in their immediate environments as these farmers, there are very few things. They've never tested them really. They're not really reliable. They're very crude ideas about various things. They're very uninformed. And it seems that would be, if I try to live like that, I would be less rational than I am. Things are. And certainly one way he doesn't put it like that, but one way, and this is less rational, is that it seems like if I try to do that, the ratio of true to false beliefs would be worse. I mean, I would have a lot of false beliefs if I try to think for myself, because I'm not that good at it, after all. I can acquire a lot of true beliefs by just believing what others believe, because those have done the research on these topics. And my evidence, it seems, would also be a lot worse, because the methods that the experts use on it are just a lot better than anything I could come up with. Now, it seems like it's sort of led this idea of epistemic independence or autonomy is really a bit of a fetish about having evidence. I mean, it's sort of about, well, you need to have the evidence yourself, but why? I mean, the evidence is around. It's fine if others have that. Why should it all be about me? That's the Hardwick idea. Now, of course, well, what if I don't know who the experts are? He thinks that we can't really get away from the experts. Then I need to ask another expert. For example, ask my doctor friend who knows about who is an expert in virology. You're not going to get away from the experts. What if the experts disagree? Hardwick thinks it's still better to go with some experts than to think for myself, because better an expert, any expert, than me. So from this, he kind of concludes that the rational thing for a layperson to do in most cases is simply to trust the experts. We'll get again to how to find the experts, which ones to trust, when we get to Goldman. Okay, so the next question then that Hardwick pursues is a question of knowledge. Is it also true that we could know that something is the case without having evidence for it? Possibly without even understanding what that proposition means? Traditionally, again, think about Descartes, the answer is no. Knowledge requires having evidence for something. Hardwick, by contrast, thinks, yes, I can know something because I know that someone else knows about it. Okay, now I think that Hardwick expresses this in the wrong way. I leave this here on the slide and I put it in the on Canvas for you to think about it. I think the way the issue he raises here is a good one, but the way he expresses it is problematic. And if you download the slides, you can read this carefully. I'll also put it on Canvas, as I said. I won't speak about it here, but I think he doesn't put it quite the right way. But I think the issue is an interesting one. So here's the issue, okay? It seems that scientific knowledge often has the following structure. A knows one thing. So, for example, knows about how this PCR method works. B knows some other thing. For example, they know stuff about the biochemistry of spike proteins. Now, some third person knows that A knows that thing, and if that's true, that's how it works, then given what he maybe has observed himself, then something follows. And another person knows that, well, yes, so if that thing that B knows about the biochemistry is true, then something else follows. And if that thing that the second one knows, then if that's true, then this third thing follows. And then there's some further person, so let's say that's me, who knows that that this person knows all these things, and then comes to a belief about P. Okay. So here, A and B, they do some original research. C and D put this research to new use and add their own, and then there's one person that puts it all together. That's the structure of most scientific knowledge, that various people have specialized knowledge and they put it together, and no one has an overview of how everything hangs together. No one has first-hand knowledge about everything. Okay, and Hardwick has this nice cutout from a physics paper where it shows like there's like 100 authors. They don't have an overview of all the details of these experiments. So in a nutshell, most advanced scientific knowledge is collaborative. And in that, no one has first-hand knowledge of even what goes into a single scientific publication. So if the output of the best scientific publications, and if that's to count as knowledge, then individually having all the relevant evidence can't be required for knowledge, since there's no one who has the knowledge. So since this seems to be the paradigm of knowledge, if that doesn't count as knowledge, that would be very bad. Now, Hardwick thinks, in fact, that there are two possible results here. On the one hand, this what he calls vicarious knowledge. So maybe it's possible to know something without yourself having evidence for it. Okay? That's one thing that Tom talked about. There's an interesting and other interesting option that he mentions is that maybe there's collective knowledge. Maybe that community of sciences knows something, even though no individual in that community knows it. I think that's a really fascinating possibility. I will also link to a more recent article that explores a possibility that even maybe you get knowledge, not just where no individual knows that particular thing, but indeed every individual follows irrational methods. Okay, so that's I'll link to that. So anyway, this. Again, if either of these is true, this idea that of epistemic autonomy, that we should all think for ourselves, seems to be undermined. So maybe there's knowledge that as well not owned by anyone, or there's vicarious knowledge where we know something simply because we know someone who knows it. Okay, with that, we'll leave Hardwick, and he again, his point was to establish that epistemic independence is, or autonomy, independence of others, is not a realistic and is not even an ideal. We would be less, it's sometimes rational to believe something simply because we know of someone who believes it, who has reason to believe it. And indeed, without doing that, we'd be less rational because we ourselves aren't all that smart, and others know more about it. Okay, that's Hardwick. We need to rely on others in order to gain knowledge, and that's an essential part also of scientific practice.